a now very well-known investigator at the NIH who did the first randomized control trial, I was maybe not skeptical, but it seemed to me that eating what is a normal diet for 4 weeks would not have any big effects on my health. I ate 80% of my calories from ultra-processed food for 4 weeks. This is a diet very typical for an American teenager.
Yeah.
This is not a weird diet.
Right.
So there were kind of three big things that happened. I gained weight, a huge amount of weight, 6.5 kilos, more than 6.5 kilos in 4 weeks.
That's like 15 pounds, right? In American pounds. Yeah.
I would have doubled my body weight in a year if I'd kept doing it. And you referenced Supersize Me. I was not force feeding myself. So I was just eating to appetite, so long as 80% of my calories came from UPF. So the experience of doing it was incredibly educational. I was never full. I was never hungry. I was just sort of eating all day because that's what the food allows you to do. So weight gain is very well evidenced. We then did functional MRI scans and looked at connectivity between different parts of the brain. This was sort of the most terrifying bit, is we saw a massive increase in connection between the automatic behavior bits at the back of the brain in the cerebellum, the habit forming bits, and the reward addiction bits in the middle of the brain. And these changes were very surprising to all of us. They were very robust and they persisted for 8 weeks after.
And what were the changes in your brain?
So we just saw huge amounts of increased connectivity between the habit bits and the reward bits. And it was, the findings are best described as if I had developed a new addiction. All of the fMRI data that you generate from any experiment is hard to be really sure of what's causing what, but we saw very significant changes, and it's notable they were between those two regions. And bear in mind, I was 43 when it was a few years ago. I was in my mid 40s doing it. It raises the question of these kind of brain changes to children who are eating much more UPF over a more prolonged period of time. And then in a way, the change I was most fascinated by, well, there were two others, but the physical change was that we measured my satiety, my hormone response to a normal meal. So this isn't something you can fake. At the beginning of the experiment, I went and I ate a standardized meal, and we measured changes in the hormones. You have fullness hormones and hunger hormones. They go up, down.
So you just didn't rely on your subjective feeling about how hungry or full you were. You actually measured the hormones like ghrelin and leptin that actually tell you whether or not you're full or hungry biologically.
And what we see is that after eating the same standard meal, at the end of the UPF diet, my fullness hormones went up much less and my hunger hormones stayed much higher. So at the end of the same meal, so the diet is modifying your body's ability to feel full after any food. And that to me was the most kind of significant thing. It's not just that the food doesn't fill you up, but we think it may be having changes about the whole way you handle food and feel full at the end of meals. Really important to say, I know I'm one participant. That's why we've turned it into a big registered clinical trial funded by, our research council and an independent research trust. And that's why we're doing it robustly with ethics permission, as a registered trial. Kevin Hall is one of them.
How many people are in that trial?
There are 2 arms, and we're doing, how many have we registered? Somewhere over 30, I think. So it's not a huge trial. It's a bit bigger than Kevin's.
Yeah, ethically, it's like you're feeding people what you know is hurting them. It's a little tricky, but people are willing to do it. I think for science, that's amazing.
Well, of course, the way the trial is designed is we're trying to feed people the healthiest ultra-processed food versus a minimally processed diet. So we didn't feel it was ethical for them to just eat any old ultra-processed food. I think the jury is in on that evidence. So instead, we fed people a diet of ultra-processed food that is in line with our national dietary guidance versus a minimally processed diet of the same thing. So we're trying to investigate the claim that if we make the ultra-processed food as healthy as we can, does it still cause negative health outcomes? And especially, does it do that in comparison to a minimally processed diet? It's asking the same question in a different and hopefully more ethical way.
That's interesting because I think, people will say, well, it's not the ultra processing, it's just the crappy food. And it's the high glycemic load or the lack of fiber or, the macronutrients that are different and the calories that are different. And if you just ate a high glycemic diet, like sugar and white flour that was organic or, you'd have the same problem.
I think there are two questions. First of all, and this has been very kind of hotly contested between people funded by the food industry and more independent scientists, is the definition of ultra-processed food useful, or is it just describing food that we already think is unhealthy? And there are a number of ways to answer that question. I think the way we currently define unhealthy food isn't working in policy terms. Okay, so whatever definition you're using, in the US, you have very weak definitions of unhealthy food. You might be able, it's not entirely easy to say how you define unhealthy food in the United States. You have dietary guidance, which is fairly good, and bits of it are aligned with international guidance. But there's nothing I can see where you go, these are a set of thresholds and criteria by which we will declare a product to be unhealthy. So for a start, when we say, is the definition useful? You have to say, well, is it useful in comparison to what? There's no question it's been incredibly powerful as a research tool. And that's what it was designed for. So the definition is set in stone. It went through a revision, but it's been in stone since 2018.
And this is the NOVA classification developed by Monteiro from Brazil, which is now part of their standard dietary guidelines, as well as Canada and other countries, right, that are using this as their metric for food. France, Israel, Belgium, most South and Central American countries, Canada, give advice using the NOVA classification. And it's a 9-paragraph definition. But the definition, and it broadly describes modern, pre-packaged, pre-prepared American industrial food. And I'm sorry, I know this is an American audience. And in fact, many transnational corporations make these products. But we're talking about food wrapped in plastic, made using additives. Now, the definition was never designed to be used in law to ban something or tax something. So when commentators say, oh, the definition it's too vague, you can't use it to define a product, absolutely. And I don't think anyone sensible is saying we should use this as the way of labeling food or taxing it or banning it. But the definition has had research power because it was testing a hypothesis. It was saying, is there something more to harmful food than simple levels of salt, sugar, and fat? And is industrially produced food different to the food you cook at home, even when you adjust for that? And so across now hundreds of research studies, I mean, just a few years ago, there were, for any one health outcome, there were maybe 10 to 15 longitudinal studies. We now have really more than 100 of the kind of prospective studies that we use to link cigarettes to lung cancer. We now have these for ultra-processed food and negative health outcomes. And what's the sort of hazard ratio? In other words, with traditional like cigarettes, it was like 10 to 20 times an increase in risk of lung cancer. So an observational study, that's a slam dunk. If it's over, 2 or 3, you usually probably have some causality, and that's 200 or 300%. And smoking was 2,000%. And so the question is, how big is the delta on them? Is it like a 20% increased risk, 100%, 200%?
Almost nothing. I can't think of anything other than maybe asbestos that has that same hazard ratio or odds ratio, however you want to calculate it in epidemiological terms, in terms of it's the magnitude of harm it causes. What we see with UPF, depending on the outcome you look at, is we see increases of, it's times 1.5, times 2, times 3. So big increases in absolute risk, exactly the kind of risks that we accept for many, many other links between, let's say poor sleep quality and early mortality, for example. So cigarettes, we see enormous deltas, but we ultra-processed food, it's smaller because diet-related disease has it's very causally dense, and there are lots of different ways that dietary patterns affect you. So one of the really important things to say is when we look at those hazard ratios, and different studies report this in different ways, almost all of the epidemiological evidence has made adjustments for dietary pattern and for nutrient profile. So if we look at, this was a study, a really well-reported study done by one of my PhD students, Sam Dicken. He's now not a PhD student. He's now leading this update trial that I was telling you about. So Sam did a review of the evidence. This was in 2021, and looked across at whether or not the epidemiological studies controlled for dietary pattern, and they almost all do. Going back to your question about how much ultra-processed food increases your risk of a particular health outcome, one of the things is that in those epidemiological studies, adjustments are made for salt, fat, sugar, fiber, and dietary pattern. Now, the logic of doing that is you're trying to go, is processing itself playing a role. And we have lots and lots of evidence that factors other than those nutrients now are playing a role. It's not simply a deficiency of fruit and vegetables or an excess of salt. But of course, one of the ways that ultra-processed food harms you is because it is incredibly high in salt, saturated fat, sugar, energy density. It has a high glycemic index. And so all of those things, when you adjust for them, they dilute essentially the effect. But the overall effect of the food on your body will have all of those different factors coming to bear on your health.
If you love that last video, you're going to love the next one. Check it out here.